On September 11, 1985, a 64-year-old man presented himself to immigration authorities in San Pedro, California. He said his name was Georg Gartner. 40 years ago, he had jumped onto a freight train that passed every other day by a prison camp in New Mexico, and since then he had lived with another name, another face, another story. His American wife didn't know who he really was. No one knew. And so, 40 years after the end of the Second World War, Georg Gartner gave himself up crying in front of the television cameras, and the world knew that he had just closed, definitively, the last chapter of a story that very few knew. The story of almost 400,000 German soldiers who lived in the heart of their most powerful enemy, who cut corn in Nebraska, picked peaches in California, cut down trees in Michigan, worked in food processors in Wisconsin. In May 1943, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Army of Africa collapsed. German and Italian troops, encircled in Tunisia by the combined advance of British and American forces, surrendered en masse. More than 250,000 Axis soldiers laid down their arms over the course of just a few days. It was the largest capitulation of the Axis up to that point, and it was the beginning of a logistical problem that no one had fully calculated. The prison camps in North Africa could not absorb such a number. Those established in British territory in Great Britain itself were already full. The Churchill government had been sending urgent signals to Washington for 2 years. The Allies needed someone else to carry the burden of guarding all these men. European facilities were collapsing. The resources to feed and sustain them were scarce. A different solution had to be found. The solution was geographical. The United States had space. It had land. It had miles and miles of prairie, desert, forest, and open country. And something else. The Liberty ships carrying supplies and troops to Europe returned empty, completely empty. The War Department saw the logic immediately. Fill the return ships with POWs, take them across the Atlantic. The ocean itself would become the most effective security fence ever built. No prisoner in his right mind would attempt to swim back to Europe. But the decision had another dimension that the generals could not ignore. In 1943, the United States had been at war for just 2 years. Farms in the Midwest, the Deep South, the Pacific Northwest were losing workers steadily. Men of productive age went to the front. The crops rotted in the fields. Food processors couldn't find labor. And there was an international agreement, the Geneva Convention of 1929, which allowed exactly what the United States needed, to make prisoners work, in exchange for financial compensation. The marriage of convenience was done. The first columns of German prisoners arrived on the US mainland in August 1942. At first there were hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. By 1944, there were 378,898 German soldiers distributed in approximately 500 camps throughout the country. 500 fields. The number is difficult to visualize. They were in Arkansas and Arizona, in Nebraska and New Jersey, in Texas, in Florida, in California, in Michigan, in small towns where people had never seen a foreigner, let alone a German. The largest concentration of camps was located in the south and southwest of the country, deliberately far from the war industries of the northeast. But over time, when the demand for farm labor exceeded all expectations, fields proliferated everywhere. Most of these men came from 2 large groups of captures. The first was Rommel's Africa Corps, veterans hardened by years of combat in the deserts of North Africa, many of them belonging to elite divisions such as the 15th Panzer Division and the Africa Division. The second group arrived after the Allied campaigns in Italy and France, beginning in 1944, and was more heterogeneous, younger, mixing veterans with 16 or 17-year-old recruits captured in the final weeks of the German collapse. For many of them, the journey on the ships was the first proof that the war, as they had known it, was over. The ships crossed the Atlantic in convoys with the prisoners crammed into the holds. The dizziness was constant, the heat in summer unbearable. Some men vomited for days. But when it arrived at East Coast ports, usually New York or Newport News in Virginia, something changed. Sergeant Helmut Herner, who would keep a detailed diary of his captivity in the United States, noted it accurately. From the windows of the train that transported them to the interior of the country, The prisoners saw cities without scars, no ruins, no burnt buildings, no endless lines of refugees. They saw cars parked in front of the most modest houses. They saw illuminated business signs, gas stations, open supermarkets. The contrast with bombing-ravaged Germany or Italy was so stark that several men stood silent, watching, unable to articulate what they felt. The Nazi regime's propaganda had insisted for years that the United States was a weak country without resources, without discipline, incapable of sustaining a serious war effort. What they saw through those train windows told them otherwise. A typical prisoner of war camp in the United States did not resemble what the cinema would have you imagine decades later. There were watchtowers and barbed wire, yes. There were armed guards. But there were also barracks with floors of wood, dining rooms with tables, improvised libraries, soccer fields, workshops, theatres. The Geneva Convention set the minimum standards, and the office of the Provost General, the military unit in charge of administering the camps, strove to meet them, partly out of humanitarian conviction, partly for a very practical reason. If German prisoners in America were mistreated, American soldiers captured in Europe could pay the consequences. The standard field was divided into two physically separate sections. On the one hand, the area of the American garrison, with its own barracks, offices and warehouses. On the other, the prisoners' compound, surrounded by wire and a buffer zone that often included sports fields. Inside the compound, 4 barracks formed a semicirculation around the dining room, the canteen and the administrative facilities that the prisoners themselves managed under minimal supervision. That last sentence deserves attention. Minimal supervision. The Geneva Convention stated that rank-ranking soldiers were not obliged to work, and non-commissioned officers could refuse non-supervisory duties. The chronic shortage of personnel in the office of the Provost General, which systematically received those rejected and the least fit from other units, made close monitoring impossible. So the de facto policy was that of the perimeter, patrols in vehicles around the wire, observation towers on the corners, and a tacit agreement that internal order was left in the hands of the Germans themselves. And the Germans organized themselves with the efficiency that characterized them. The non-commissioned officers took control of daily life with a speed that surprised the American guards. The morning formations, the inspections of barracks, the division of tasks, the maintenance of order during meals, everything went back to working according to the German military hierarchy as if the men had never left the army. The prison camp became a barracks with no combat mission. Former prisoner Georg Gartner, captured in Tunisia in May 1943 as a sergeant in the Afrika Korps, described it years later with an exact phrase. Entering Camp Hood in Texas was, he said, like coming home. German discipline had recreated itself with its orders, its commands, its hierarchy. The Afrika Korps was a disciplined force where everyone obeyed as one man, he recalled. Parallel structures sprang up immediately. That was also a problem, because within these parallel structures the most convinced elements of the Nazi ideology found the perfect platform to impose themselves. At Camp Aliceville, Alabama, the largest in the country, with about 6,000 prisoners, tensions between ideologically warring groups escalated into violence. At Camp Huntsville, Texas, the first camp established in the country, there was a riot on November 25, 1943, that left 1 dead and several wounded. The clash was always the same. Those who wanted to keep the flame of Nazism alive inside the wire, and those who had begun to question it or simply wanted to survive in peace. The clandestine courts, the night beatings, the kangaroo trials that ended in summary convictions. There is a documented record of all this. Throughout the entire network of camps, 14 prisoners were convicted by internal guards of murder or provocation of suicide of comrades declared traitors. Each of them argued until the end that he had only fulfilled his duty. The US authorities tended to interpret all internal violence as an expression of Nazi totalitarianism. The analysis was too simple. Sociologists Edward Shils and Morris Janowitz, who worked for the Psychological Warfare Division of the Allied Forces in Europe, came to a more nuanced conclusion. What held German units together even after defeat was not political conviction but group cohesion. Soldiers displayed Nazi symbols because that was what their military subculture expected of them, not necessarily because they believed in every point of the party program. Loyalty was to the comrade, to the non-commissioned officer, to the soldier's code of honor. Changing that code required much more than removing the most visible leaders. What no one disputed was the quality of material life in the American camps, especially compared to the fate of the prisoners in Soviet hands. Rommel's men who surrendered preferred, when they had a choice, to fall prisoners of the British or the Americans. Ernst Floater, a soldier who was later interviewed in Michigan, put it bluntly. He wanted to be captured by Westerners because he knew what awaited those who fell on the other side. Stories from the Eastern Front circulated throughout the barracks. The brutality of the Soviet camps, the forced marches in the middle of the Russian winter, the shocking mortality. Adelbert Hall, a German officer who did end up in Soviet hands after Stalingrad, described decades later a train transport that lasted 18 days, with only 15 minutes a day outside the car, without enough food, under temperatures that froze the metal of the rails. In US camps, prisoners received the same caloric rations as American soldiers, between 2,000 and 3,000 calories a day, access to medical services, work clothes, and the equivalent of 80-cent canteen vouchers per day's work. They could buy cigarettes, paper, soap, chocolate. Some camps had pools built by the prisoners themselves with their own wages. There were libraries with hundreds of titles. There were theatre companies that staged plays by Schiller and Goethe. There were soccer tournaments that generated so much passion that the guards ended up betting on the bets. Ruth Beaumont Cook, a local historian from Aliceville, Alabama, collected the testimony of Herman Blumhardt, a former prisoner, who described his first night in the camp with genuine amazement. "I had arrived expecting mistreatment, hunger, forced labor. He found organized barracks, personal belongings on the shelves, clean sheets. That calmed my fears," he said. What he feared was what he had seen or heard from the Eastern Front. What he found was something else entirely. All this, of course, had its political price, and the bills soon started to arrive. In October 1943, a Gallup poll asked the American population who the country's main enemy was. 53% answered Japan. Only 34% said Germany. The war in the Pacific, Pearl Harbor, Guadalcanal, the Japanese advance through Asia, dominated the minds of ordinary Americans with an intensity that the war in Europe did not reach. And yet, it was the Germans who ate steak and bacon in the inland fields, while the husbands and brothers of American families fought in the Italian Apennines. The newspapers were filled with complaints. The most repeated was that of the mimes. A New York Times article described piles of juicy hams, butter galore, steaks, and sausages in prisoners' dining rooms. "There is only one limit to what men eat, their own capacity," wrote correspondent F.G. Allitson Cook. "They get absolutely everything they can keep from any dish on the menu, rationed out or not." Other articles, published in Atlantic Monthly and later reproduced in Reader's Digest, compared the American approach to the Soviet one and did not fare well. The critics' argument was not only emotional, it was strategic. Here were nearly 400,000 young men who would return to Germany after the war. They would be among the most active citizens of post-war Germany. What they thought of the United States, what they remembered of their captivity, mattered. Wasn't it a unique opportunity to mold their minds toward democracy, to prepare the ground for Germany to become an ally rather than a future enemy? That was precisely the line of argument that the State and War Departments pressed against Roosevelt. The president was skeptical. He had spent a few months as a child in a German school at the age of 9 during a vacation in Germany in 1891, and from there he left with a lasting impression of Germanic militarism. For Roosevelt, the Germans were a fundamental cultural problem, not simply victims of their leaders. His Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, had a plan: to completely dismantle German industry after the war, to return the country to a subsistence agrarian economy. No industry, no junkers, no possible militarism. Secretary of War Henry Stimson and Secretary of State Cordell Hull resisted that plan. To destroy Germany was to destroy the European economy, and besides, without a positive alternative to offer the Germans, The vacuum left by Nazism would be filled by communism. That was the real fear. The sociologist Talcott Parsons formulated it clearly in a report to the government. Trying to convert Germans to democracy could push the most disoriented towards democracy. Communism, which was infinitely more dangerous than letting defeated Nazism die naturally, but the pressure of public opinion, fueled by those newspaper articles about well-fed prisoners while American soldiers died, proved politically untenable. Eleanor Roosevelt, who had personally questioned Major Maxwell McKnight, the camp's chief of operations, reported directly to the president. Roosevelt, in the spring of 1944, finally gave his approval to launch a re-education program for German prisoners on American soil. The program would be officially called the Special Projects Division, with the acronym SPD, and it would be one of the most ambitious, clumsy, and most fascinating intellectual ventures the US government has ever attempted. By early 1945, congressional representatives from agricultural states were still sending urgent petitions to the War Department. They needed 100,000 more prisoners to solve the labor shortage. It was not a rhetorical exaggeration. The sugar beet fields in Nebraska, the peach orchards in California, the cotton plantations in Texas, the onion fields in Michigan, the pulp forests in northern Wisconsin, all depended on seasonal labor that working-age men had abandoned when they went to the front or to the war industries. The government had a clear equation. Farmers paid the federal government the prevailing civilian rate for each prisoner employed, in areas where the War Labor Commission had certified labor shortages on the explicit grounds of avoiding unfair competition with employers who used free civilian labor. The government retained most of it to pay for the operation of the fields. The prisoner was paid 80 cents a day in canteen vouchers, and the result was a good business. In 1944, agriculture alone generated $22 million for the federal coffers. The services that the prisoners provided in military installations of the army itself saved an additional $80 million that same year. But the presence of such captive labor had another consequence that economists quietly pointed out. It kept agricultural wages artificially low in those areas. If farmers in South Texas or the Central Plain could access workers at a government-subsidized cost, they had no incentive to raise the wages they offered to free laborers. Civilian day laborers, many of them Latin American migrants, the braceros that the Mexican government sent by bilateral agreement, competed in a depressed market for the presence of prisoners paid directly by the state. The system worked better than anyone had anticipated, in part because the Germans turned out to be exceptionally efficient workers. Michigan farmers recalled with admiration the discipline of their imprisoned employees. They arrived on time, worked 8 hours a day without complaint, and the very military code of honor that kept them cohesive in the fields also made them work as a group with a coordination that no agricultural employer would have easily obtained from individual workers. But there was a structural tension that program administrators resolved pragmatically and not always gracefully. The Geneva Convention stated that prisoners should be protected from hazardous work. In northern Michigan, the pulp industry was clamoring for hands to cut down trees. Did logging qualify as hazardous work? The government studied the accident rates in the sector and concluded that it did not. The prisoners of the Afrika Korps, men who had crossed the Sahara under Allied artillery fire, spent their American winters cutting pine trees in upper Pennsylvania in freezing temperatures. The camps in northern Michigan, Autrain, Evelyn, Raco, Sydnor, Pori, Wetmore, housed about 1,250 prisoners when logging businessmen had asked for 3,500. Evelyn's camp began in 1943. Government inspection reports found no violations of the convention. What they did find was a complaint. There was a lack of Protestant pastor for religious services, and there were no tournaments organized in recreational activities. The YMCA funded the tournaments. The pastor's problem was solved more slowly. The relationship between prisoners and employers went far beyond labor exchange in many cases. In Frankenmuth, Michigan, the Herzog family employed several prisoners on their farm for years. Otto Herzog treated his men well. He fed them enough, treated them with respect, held conversations. Carl Jung, one of his employees, pointed out years later in a letter that Herzog was the first farmer in Frankenmuth to have served the prisoners enough food. He also described, with obvious pleasure and no apparent awareness that it was officially forbidden, that he had gone inside the American farmhouse and talked to the women of the family. War Department regulations forbade fraternization. Michigan farmers who needed the crop harvested before frost hit didn't always find the time to remind their employees. When the war ended and the men returned to Germany, letters began to arrive. Years of letters. Jürgen Kracht wrote to him describing Germany as a land of cold and hunger, and his days in Michigan as a paradise on earth by comparison. He asked her to send him photos of when he worked on the farm so he could have them during the difficult months. He said that a cigarette cost 6 or 7 marks, that there were no clothes available in the shops, that food was expensive. Fritz Kahner, another former prisoner of the Herzog farm, fled East Prussia in winter as a refugee. His wife Hilda wrote describing how they spent whole weeks on dry bread and little milk, and a week's ration had to be enough for a whole month. Otto Herzog sent packages. In a record from February 1947, the contents of one of these shipments are noted with the meticulousness of an accountant. Soup of beef noodles, mushroom soup, chicken gumbo soup, beef soup, honey, Velveeta cheese, canned pâtés, candies, Vita salt, butter caramel. The Germans responded with a gratitude that touched something deeper than mere courtesy. Rudi Jerker named his first newborn son Otto, after the farmer who had treated him like a human being. In the records of the Frankenmuth Historical Commission, Otto Herzog is listed as the godfather of little Otto Jerker. Not all employers were like Otto Herzog. Helmut Herner, in his captivity diary, noted encounters with farmers who tried to make prisoners work beyond the established hours, with supervisors who threatened sanctions that they had no authority to impose, with American guards who looked the other way when someone exploited them in the details of work outside the camp. The system was diffuse enough to allow for abuses, especially in remote areas where supervision was minimal and the temptation to squeeze out a workforce that could not protest was great. In some Texas fields, farmers complained that prisoners did not reach the quota that a woman or child in the cotton field reached, and they attributed the problem to military pride, soldiers who refused to work too fast so as not to appear docile. And yet, stories of exploitation coexist in historical records with stories of something that had no official name: normality. In Shelby, Oceana County, Michigan, prisoners slept in tents on the local high school football field when the harvest season stretched into the fall. Football season began in August. Shelby's high school team had to play their games in Hart on the field of the rival high school because the Germans were occupying theirs. No one, it seems, protested too much. The relationship between prisoners and the civilian community had another layer that official reports avoided dealing with in detail, that of the African-American soldiers who guarded them. The U.S. military was segregated. Black soldiers were systematically assigned to support, guard, and service duties, rarely combat. Many of the guards in the German prison camps were black men who, paradoxically, guarded white prisoners in Hitler's army, who in many cases received better treatment, access to restaurants and public spaces in southern cities than the soldiers who guarded them. The absurdity did not go unnoticed by anyone. Some German prisoners openly pointed out the contradiction. The country that imprisoned them preached democracy and equality while humiliating its own citizens because of the color of their skin. African-American guards, for their part, in several cases established unexpected bonds of solidarity with prisoners, finding in the shared status of subordinates a point of contact that no official policy would have predicted. What survived in the collective memory of rural American communities were not these conflicts. It was other things. The smell of fresh fruit in the trucks, the sound of prisoners singing in German as they traveled in the platforms open to the work camps. They still remember it in Shelby, not as a memory of war, but as the sound of men who looked human, even though they came from the other side of the world. A county elder summed it up in a 2018 interview with historian Abigail Runk when she was looking for the exact word to describe how neighbors felt about those prisoners. They didn't feel like the enemy. Major General Archer Lurch took over as military provost general in 1944 and arrived convinced that the re-education project was a great opportunity, both for the prisoners and for his own career. Lurch had spent much of his military life as a college instructor in ROTC programs in Berkeley and Florida. He knew how to combine weapons with classrooms. Under his impetus, the State Department and the War Department presented on March 2, 1944, a joint plan for the indoctrination of German prisoners of war. That plan, with minor adjustments, would remain in force until the dissolution of the program in 1946. The premise of the plan was curious. He took it for granted that German prisoners were a cultured people with a high level of education who would respond to rational exposure to American values. The document described Germans as proud patriots with intense political awareness and refined culture. It was a deliberately generous description, designed to justify the program's intellectual approach. No crude propaganda, no brainwashing. Only the honest and worthy presentation of a better alternative. The problem was that this description was, in part, a fiction. The German education system divided young people from the age of 10 into two currents: a tiny elite who accessed classical secondary education, and a large majority who spent their school years in vocational technical training schools. For most German soldiers in the camps, the word democracy was as abstract as the word quantum. But the architects of the program were not soldiers. They were mobilized university professors, most of them from the humanities, with no significant military experience and with a training completely alien to the world of barracks and internment camps. When they needed personnel for the Special Projects Division, they discovered that the best experts in German culture were already busy in other ventures of the war effort. Those who got it were, in the words of historian Ron Robin, the troopers of the academic profession, not the stars. Competent, many of them, but with no experience whatsoever with the dynamics of life in a prison camp. The program began in secret for two reasons. First, the Geneva Convention prohibited explicit propaganda against prisoners without defining it too well where education ended and propaganda began. Second, the SPD feared that if prisoners identified the program as an attempt to shape their thinking, they would reject it out of pride or conviction. So in its first phase, between the autumn of 1943 and the spring of 1945, the SPD operated undercover. His main tool was printed paper. In the headquarters they called, with a certain academic humor, the Idea Factory, a select group of German prisoners with anti-Nazi tendencies working under American supervision, produced reading materials, prepared lists of approved books for the camp libraries, and above all, edited a newspaper. On March 1, 1945, the first issue of Der Ruf came off the presses. The name means the call or the summons. The opening editorial invited German prisoners to acknowledge that they had their own newspaper, far above any party or small group quarrels, dedicated to fostering true German culture and serving all. Reports from the camps reached the head of the SPD's program branch, Captain Walter Schoenstedt, in the following days. Some regional commanders wrote cautiously optimistically. The newspaper was selling well. Major Crazy of the 1st Service Command reported that it was a sign of success that it displeased both radical anti-Nazis and hardened Nazis, while the moderate centre seemed receptive. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Davison, head of the SPD, did not share this enthusiasm. He read the opening article of Der Ruf, entitled The Inner Powers, and noticed that it was so dense and airtight that it was practically incomprehensible. He wrote to Schoenstedt that the paper needed a lighter tone, shorter words, less abstraction, more concreteness. Davison was right. The lead article in the first issue condemned the massification of man, the tendency toward group behavior at the expense of the inner creative impulse, weakened by the noisy slogans of modern industrialized societies. The text was so ambiguous that the anti-Nazi camp at Camp Devens detected hidden Nazi propaganda in it, while at the heavily Nazified camp at Aliceville, Alabama, it was considered to be obviously anti-Nazi, because it contradicted the Nazi philosophy of the primacy of the state over the individual. The same article was being attacked simultaneously from two opposite flanks for completely opposite reasons. The SPD representative at Camp Carson sent a lapidary report of the 2,000 prisoners in his camp. Perhaps 5 or 6 were intellectuals capable of understanding the newspaper. The others did not read it. The shipping address didn't help either. The newspaper did not have a prison camp address. It had a general post office box. The prisoners were immediately suspicious. Which prisoners were they talking about who lived like them if their mailing address was a government locker? The editors of Der Ruf were real writers. Alfred Anders and Hans Werner Richter, who would make literary history in post-war Germany as founders of the 47 Group, the most influential German literary association of the second half of the 20th century, had been imprisoned for their anti-Nazi sympathies in the idea factory. They were brilliant men with deliberately opaque prose, discussing in depth German collective guilt, internal emigration, the writers who stayed in Germany under Nazism, the meaning of defeat, topics that fascinated a tiny intellectual sector of the camps and that left the rest completely indifferent. The German private wanted to know if his parents had survived the bombings. I wanted to read about football. He wanted news from his hometown. He wanted to know if his house was still standing. Der Ruf told him about Goethe and the architecture of the Bauhaus as a symbol of the Weimar Republic. In July 1945, the editorial team offered their collective resignation. Among their reasons, he said that they watched angrily as other, less cooperative prisoners were repatriated before them. The SPD did not accept the resignation. Der Ruf continued to be published until the close of the program. If Der Ruf was the show's star vehicle, books and movies were its secondary allies. Both generated controversies that illuminate, indirectly, something about how America functioned in times of war. In 1945, the SPD launched the Bücherei Neue Welt, the New World Collection, a series of books in German sold exclusively in camp canteens. The premise was that of the intellectual canon of the great books, to expose prisoners to texts capable of awakening their critical sense and preparing them for democracy. Howard Mumford Jones, the renowned Harvard University professor who had joined the SPD, was in charge of supervising the literary selection. The resulting list was curious. Of the 24 books on the original list, only 5 were by American authors. Among the German authors selected, all were exiles from the Third Reich. Thomas Mann, with 3 books, topped the list. Franz Werfel, Erich Maria Remarque, Karl Zuckmayer, Arnold Zweig. They had all left Germany. None represented the so-called internal emigration, the group of writers who had remained under the regime and argued that they had passively resisted from within. The selection criteria were as political as they were literary. The authors included were not only anti-Nazis, they had publicly expressed positive assessments of the United States during their exile. Thomas Mann was living in California when he was elected, Franz Werfel too. Werfel, who had begun his American life as an uncomfortable critic of Anglo-Saxon materialism, had become one of its warmest advocates. His novel, The Song of Bernadette, was selected by the American Book of the Month Club, made into a film in Hollywood in 1943, and made Werfel a popular phenomenon in a country that rarely paid attention to Central European literature. The admiration was reciprocal, and the SPD took advantage of it. Among Americans, the list was equally revealing. Hemingway was, with For Whom the Bell Tolls, chosen in part because its hero Robert Jordan never showed an unwavering ideological commitment even while fighting for the communist cause in Spain. There was also Wendell Willkie with One World, the account of his 1942 world tour, which described a future of global peace based on interdependence. And there was William Saroyan with The Human Comedy, chosen mainly because it painted an America without class divisions, where rich and poor, old Protestants and new immigrants lived together in harmony within the same school classroom. But the selection had a hole that the show's editors themselves acknowledged without resolving it. The list completely ignored the most popular American writer in Germany before the war. Jack London had sold more than 30 million copies on the German market between the 2 world wars. His adventures as hardliners in extreme territories had a trans-ideological appeal. Socialists read him for his class sympathies, young people for his adventurous spirit, and Nazis for the image of the physically superior Anglo-Saxon that appeared in several of his works. The Nazi regime had not banned it. That was precisely what removed him from the SPD list. If Goebbels had not censored him, he was suspect by default. Howard Mumford Jones was quick to raise objections to the very program he oversaw. In an article published in the New York Times while still working for the SPD, he questioned the fundamental premise that literature could serve as a cultural bridge. He reasoned with a concrete historical example. In the 18th century, there was a cosmopolitan culture genuinely shared between Horace Walpole, Frederick the Great, Catherine the Great, Benjamin Franklin, and Voltaire. But that was not interculturality. It was simply that all these individuals, despite their different nationalities, were products of the same literary and philosophical system. The same work produced completely different readings in minds formed in different traditions. Neither Goethe nor Hemingway were going to have the same effect on a 21-year-old German private raised under Nazism as on an American college lecturer in Boston. The films generated a different and much sharper conflict. The SPD director originally proposed reserving cinema for educational and scientific documentaries. But prisoners went out of their way to see anything projected on the makeshift screens, paying 15 cents of their daily wages, more than a third of their daily earnings, without complaint. By the end of September 1945, 4 months after the controlled circuit was established, the SPD reported more than 3 million total admissions, an average of about 10 films per prisoner. The problem was that local field commanders, before the SPD set up that controlled circuit, were randomly screening films: Lady Scarface, Playgirl, Millionaire Playboy, Wolfman, Boy Slaves, Dead End, 7 Miles from Alcatraz. Gangster comedies, B-movie thrillers, stories of criminals who climbed the social ladder at gunpoint, and in particular those that showed women and children as victims or protagonists of crime. The most intransigent Nazi non-commissioned officers used these projections as evidence. Look, they told their comrades, Nazi propaganda was right. America is a place of crime, corruption, and decadence. The SPD had its own reasons for worrying about that catalogue of films, but not exactly the same. For the program's educators, what was disturbing was not the violence itself. The official circuit they later established included dozens of westerns and war movies with plenty of armed action, but the social image conveyed by those cheap films. Lady Scarface and Playgirl showed women as protagonists of organized crime. Boy Slaves showed children turned into criminals by a system that had abandoned them. In the cultural logic of the time, women and children were not complicated individuals who made personal mistakes. They were symbols of the state of society. If women and children were criminals, society was rotten to its foundations. The answer was to set up a centralized circuit and prepare German synopses for each film before the screening to frame the right message. Captain Otto Englander, officer in charge of the film branch of the SPD, was the architect of that system. Its synopses were not neutral summaries. They were directed interpretations. For each potentially problematic scene, the German text explained what the prisoners were meant to see in it, and why that was evidence of American democratic values and not their degeneration. The film that gave Englander the most work was Warner Brothers' Frisco Kid from 1935. A story of gangsters in San Francisco set at the turn of the century. Englander defended her to his superiors by explaining that the character of the kid, when finally arrested, said, "Someday I will come back and help build instead of destroy." It was a minor phrase in a B-movie, but for Englander, it was the heart of the message that the prisoners were to take home. The most intense case was that of Harry Warner, the founder of Warner Brothers, and one of the most respected men in the American film industry. Warner was Jewish and had immediate family who had survived the concentration camps. When he learned that the SPD wanted to use films from his studio to entertain German prisoners, he wrote Lieutenant General W.D. Steyer a fiery letter. "These people have been trained to believe that we are soft, confused-headed idiots," he wrote. "They have been taught to believe that their cruelty and brutality is a virtue, and that our humanity is a failure." And he added in capital letters, "And we want to entertain you." Warner was someone whose political weight could not be ignored. His studio had released Confessions of a Nazi Spy in 1939, Hollywood's first openly anti-Nazi film, which was banned in more than 20 countries. When the Senate Committee on Interstate Commerce investigated in 1941 whether the industry, while the film industry was campaigning to drag the United States into the war, Warner Brothers was the main target of the accusations. Warner had staked his political capital on the fight against Nazism before the American government did, and now the same government was asking him to put his films at the service of entertaining Hitler's soldiers. The negotiation was tense. Warner met with SPD Director Edward Davison and threatened to take his complaint directly to President Truman, with whom he had a personal relationship. He ended up giving up on some titles and demanding the retirement of others. The SPD withdrew the most objected films and promised to produce documentary material about German atrocities to balance the scales. The documentary was produced, but in slow motion. Rivalries between army departments, the Signal Corps, which oversaw audiovisual media, viewed the SPD project as an invasion of its territory, delayed the launch until mid-September 1945. By then, all the camps had already received footage of the liberated concentration camps from other sources. The documentary sequence, jointly produced by Schaef, with footage from Bergen-Belsen, Dachau and Buchenwald. The prisoners had already seen these images and had come to their own conclusions about whether to believe them or not. The net result of the film program was, paradoxically, the most honest of all the SPD's experiments. The prisoners went to watch everything voraciously, processed the films through their own filters, and left the cinema with the same convictions they brought. But they had gone 3 hours without thinking about The Wire. For some, that was enough. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The next day, exactly 1 day after the end of the war in Europe, the SPD established the Experimental Administrative School for Selected German Prisoners of War at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island. The war was over. The question now was what to do with nearly 400,000 prisoners who would soon have to return home. The SPD's response was to turn urgency into opportunity. The War Department set March 31, 1946, as the deadline for the repatriation of all prisoners. There was less than a year left. With that countdown as a background, the SPD moved from the covert phase to the overt phase, and from intellectual subtlety to shock courses in democracy. Howard Mumford Jones was appointed director of the experimental school and designed the personal curriculum, a 60-day semester with all the elements of an American college campus. Daily lectures on German history and American civilization, morning discussion groups in the format of a university seminar, midterm and final exams, written works graded by selected prisoner assistants, colloquia with visiting professors from Ivy League universities, Arnold Wolfers from Yale, Robert Ulick and Carl Vita from Harvard. The guest list was impressive, the content was ambitious, the results were ambiguous. Of the 101 students originally enrolled, 73 made it to the graduation ceremony on July 6, 1945. Jones presented a final report that mixed satisfaction with devastating self-criticism. The selection of students had been chaotic. Many arrived without sufficient academic level to follow a university program. No one had verified that most of the Allied military administrations in Germany automatically rejected anyone with ties, however tenuous, to organizations affiliated with the Nazi Party, which excluded trade unionists, members of professional unions, participants in youth organizations. The graduates of Fort Kearny arrived in occupied Germany with their diplomas and found that no one knew who they were, nor wanted them. The experimental school was the laboratory. Fort Getty and Fort Wetherill, both in Rhode Island, were the projects at scale. The first housed Project 2, the elite administrative school for the most promising prisoners. The second, Project 3, was the police school, dedicated to training cadres to support the Allied occupation forces in Germany. Of 17,883 candidates screened for both projects, 14,172 were rejected. Only 455 entered the administrative school and 488 entered the police school. Some went through the polygraph test. The selection criteria added a revealing novelty. Prisoners with communist background or tendencies were excluded. Not communists, but communists. The adjective indefinite was broad enough to weed out anyone with leftist sympathies, Union history, or suspicious readings. The program that taught democracy applied in its own admission process an ideological purge. Tension exploded in the summer of 1945. Major General Lurch, while Davison and Schoenstedt were temporarily stationed in Europe to establish a similar program in France, ordered the SPD headquarters moved from New York to Washington and took advantage of the absence of the program chiefs to initiate a purge of loyalty among the teaching staff. A number of officers were dismissed or reassigned for vague security reasons. Major Maxwell McKnight, acting director of the SPD, received the dismissal of his deputy without notice and submitted his resignation. Howard Mumford Jones, who had years of honorable academic career, also resigned, writing to General Lurch that he did not understand why men already authorized by the American authorities needed to be investigated again. The farewell meeting for Jones on August 6, 1945, was secretly monitored by General Lurch's personal aide, Major Gemmell, who later wrote in his report that he heard a lot of jokes about everyone is a communist, but that no one was serious about communism or loyalties. His personal conclusion? None of those present were communists. Lurch left for Korea in October 1945, appointed American military governor. He died there of a heart attack, carried by those who knew him by stress of a position that surpassed him. Before he died, he had journalists and writers who disturbed public order in Korea threatened with arrest. The man who had purged a democracy program of leftists ended up suppressing freedom of the press in his next assignment. Davison, on returning, returned the posts to those who had lost them, and with Lurch's departure, the liberal program was restored to its original lines. On January 4, 1946, at Fort Eustis, Virginia, the first cycle of what the SPD called the orientation program began. It was the latest bet in the re-education program and the most ambitious in numerical terms. 6-day weeks for selected groups of prisoners before their repatriation to Germany. The selection system classified prisoners into 3 categories: white, grey, and black. The whites entered Fort Eustis directly. Blacks were returned to their fields. The greys went through additional tests, including, in some cases, the polygraph. 70% of the prisoners were automatically disqualified. In Nazi Germany, almost any job, union, youth organization, or professional association had some link to the state and, by extension, to the party. Membership in the Hitler Youth was grounds for disqualification, although membership was mandatory for all young Germans. Those who passed the filters arrived at Fort Eustis as loose individuals, without their usual companions, without the military hierarchy that had sustained them for years. They were asked to remove all rank badges. They were randomly assigned to groups, regardless of their specialty or background. The purpose was exactly that, to dissolve the group structures that had so resisted re-education efforts in the regular camps. The 6-day program was dense. The first day began with a lecture entitled The Democratic Way of Life, which carefully explained that American democracy was not a set of abstract principles or the result of great philosophical minds. It was a mental attitude, a set of practical assumptions about living together. Differences of opinion are natural, inevitable, the course text said, but honest conviction cannot become blind obstinacy. The American secret was commitment, the willingness to give something up in order for something to move forward. The geography of the United States featured prominently in the conferences. T.V. Smith, a philosopher at the University of Chicago, and former director of the re-education program for the occupying forces in Italy, argued that the physical distance between American powers had historically prevented the concentration of control. It was a peculiar thesis, but it served the purpose of showing that American democracy was not the result of innate virtues, but of geographical features that any nation could replicate if it distributed power intelligently enough. The lectures on German history, given by the historian Henry Ehrman, began with a fact that was always shocking. Most of the prisoners did not know who Hugo Preuss, the main author of the Weimar Constitution, had been. 57% of the students in the elite program were unable to name him. Neither do 41% of college graduates, 50% did not know the name Karl Schurz, nor could they name a single pre-World War I social democratic leader. The education of the Third Reich had methodically erased the memory of democratic Germany. Ehrman built his course around that emptiness. It showed that democracy was not an Anglo-Saxon import, but had genuine roots in the German tradition, especially in the local governments and trade unions of the Weimar Republic. What had failed was the compromise mechanism, the willingness to compromise and negotiate. The Germans, he argued, had a democratic system that functioned at low levels of politics and had abandoned it when the uncompromising principles of their leaders turned a repressible conflict into an irrepressible one. The films complemented the lectures. One night they were screening Abe Lincoln in Illinois, the film adaptation of Robert Sherwood's play about the young Lincoln, to show how American democracy had produced leaders capable of guiding the country even through the Civil War. Another night they showed The Seventh Cross, an adaptation of Anna Seger's novel about an anti-Nazi who escapes from a concentration camp and is helped by ordinary citizens. The latter film was especially uncomfortable for the prisoners, because it directly attacked the most useful argument of the German defense. We were small men and we could do nothing. The protagonist of The Seventh Cross was exactly that little man, and in the film he decided to help, even though he knew the risk he was running. Only 30% of the prisoners at Fort Eustis said they felt the message of that movie was okay with them. 55% remained silent. 15% protested openly. By July 23, 1946, 23,142 prisoners had completed the Fort Eustis program. The graduation ceremony of each cycle included the collective reading of a poem by Stephen Vincent Benet, A Prayer for the United Nations, which asked prisoners to feel part of a world where the oppression of one was the oppression of all. There were graduates who applauded with genuine enthusiasm. There were others who were looking at the ground. In the spring of 1946, as prisoners waited at boarding centers to be sent to Europe, the army conducted a massive survey of more than 22,000 men. The results, published at a press conference with official optimism, were impressive. 78% rejected the idea that individuals exist only to serve the state. Only 6% still believed that Germans were a superior race destined for world domination. 83% of men aged 36 to 40 said they were not willing to fight the same war again if they knew they would survive. Democracy was the preferred system of government. The SPD declared that it had succeeded in converting 61% of the inmates from a neutral position to a positive appreciation for democracy. The press conference did not mention other results of the same survey. 57% of respondents attributed at least some of the responsibility for the misfortunes that had led Germany to war on the Jews. An additional 10% did not answer that question. Only 30% accepted reports of Nazi concentration camps and atrocities as truth. The others dismissed them as Allied propaganda. Even among the graduates of Fort Eustis, the most selectly filtered group in the entire program, 10% still believed that Jews were partly responsible for Germany's calamities. Sociologists Donald McGranahan and Maurice Janowitz, who had administered a similar survey of German prisoners in French camps under American administration, offered a more austere interpretation. Democratic responses, they argued, were not a sign of conversion. They were a sign that the prisoners had learned what answers their captors wanted to hear. They were the manifestation of the same blind obedience that had made them follow Hitler. They now followed their new masters just as easily. "They are totalitarian young people looking for leadership," they wrote. They now repeat what they considered to be the official views of their current masters. Captain William Moulton, one of the program's former instructors, traveled to Germany in 1947 to follow up with graduates of elite projects. He found a disheartening panorama. The best graduates of Project 2 at Fort Getty, those who were supposed to become democratic cadres for post-war Germany, had arrived in the American occupation government and discovered that no one knew who they were. No one expected them. The Allied military administrations had no instructions to favor them or give them positions of responsibility. Many described the occupation government as a military dictatorship and were embarrassed to have to explain to other Germans that Americans are not really like that. Moulton wrote confidentially to his former SPD colleagues, "The picture was that of alienated, disappointed men, without a support network, feeling marginal both in the new Germany and in the American project that had shaped them." Captain Robert Kunzig was one of the SPD officers who accompanied the first group of direct returnees from Fort Eustis to Germany in the spring of 1999. 1946. The ship crossed the Atlantic. He anchored at Le Havre, France. The prisoners boarded a train. The train moved eastward. Kunzig described it like this: "When the train approached the border in the Saarland region, I sensed a tension in the men. I could see it in his eyes. They crowded the doors for that first look. Then they saw, and they will remember it forever. Ruin, desolation and destruction framed in that open door. The only sound was the lone cry of the distant engine. One of the prisoners was named Hans. His house was in the next village on a small street near the tracks. The train rounded a curve. Kunzig heard the man gasp. The house was not there. Neither does the people. Just mounds of rubble." The SPD spent years trying to shape the thinking of these men with books by Hemingway and Schiller, with films by Gary Cooper and debates about the Weimar Constitution. What really changed post-war Germany was not any course in democracy. It was just that, the view from the train window, total destruction, the end of all that had been. The cities that they had thought invincible turned into lunar landscapes. Nazism would not survive in the ruins because there was nothing left to nest in. A new order would have to be built from ground level. Helmut Herner, the sergeant who kept a diary of his captivity in America, wrote when he got home, "The sign of our times is ruins. They surround our lives. They line the streets of our cities. They are our reality." The writer Hans Werner Richter, a former member of the SPD's Idea Factory, formulated it more directly. The ruins were not the cemetery of the past. They were the obligatory starting point for the future. Here comes the part that the official SPD communiques systematically omitted. Of the approximately 380,000 German prisoners who were on American soil at the end of the war, only about 25,000, graduates of elite re-education programs, were repatriated directly to Germany. The rest were first sent to Western Europe as labor for reconstruction. France, devastated by years of occupation and combat, insistently demanded German prisoners for its coal mines, shipyards and camps. The agreement was part of the war reparations. Britain also received contingents. It was only in 1947 and 1948 when the Western powers began to understand that they needed the Germans as allies in the coming Cold War. That definitive repatriation was accelerated. For the prisoners, the news that they were not returning directly home but to the French labor camps was a jolt that nearly destroyed everything the SPD had built. Major Paul Newland, head of the SPD's Field Service branch, sent an urgent note to his superiors. The prisoners were stunned, had become indifferent to everything, and the toughest Nazis were walking around the barracks saying, "I told you so." The reaction of some camp commanders did not help. They explained to the prisoners that this change of plans was not a real infringement of their rights because they are not free citizens and, as such, they do not have the right to the full realization of democratic principles. The irony was overwhelming. The program that had spent months teaching democracy and individual rights now invoked prisoner status to deny them those same rights. Hans Schmid, one of the prisoners who had worked in Michigan for the Bishop family, wrote from a French camp in September 1947, describing work in the mines, poor health and food shortages. Gerolf von Schönborn, who had worked for Otto Herzog in Frankenmuth, also passed through the French camps. In his letter to the German-American farmer, he described the lack of food and thanked a package containing homemade cookies, cigarettes, chocolate, soap and canned food. The image is what it is. Men who had lived in American camps with access to saloons, movies and soccer fields, writing from French fields asking for soap. The contrast was noted by the prisoners themselves. Comparing the American camps with the French or the Soviets was inevitable, and the result, paradoxically, reinforced something that no democracy book had ever achieved, a genuine admiration for the American way of doing things, not because of the professor's arguments, because of experience. On September 21, 1945, 3.5 months after Germany's surrender, an Afrika Korps sergeant named Georg Gärtner cut the barbed wire at Camp Deming in New Mexico and jumped onto a freight train that passed by every other day. Gärtner was from Schweidnitz in Silesia, born on December 18, 1920. He had served in the 15th Panzer Division under Rommel's command. He had been captured in Tunisia in May 1943 and sent to the United States. He spoke fluent English, which gave him a huge advantage in surviving in the wild. And he had a powerful reason for not wanting to be repatriated. Silesia, his homeland, had been left on the Soviet side of the new Europe. To return meant to return to a reality that no longer existed. The train took him to California. He worked as a farm laborer in the San Joaquin Valley, picking fruit. He moved up the social ladder with a skill which would have seemed like fiction if it had not been true. He changed his name to Dennis Wiles. He became a ski instructor. Then he became a tennis instructor. He organized charity tennis tournaments for celebrities. He was photographed with Elizabeth Taylor and Robert Stack. He married in 1964 an American woman who knew nothing of his past. He moved at least 20 times. He kept his secret for 40 years. Sometime in the early 1980s, Gärtner read a book by historian Arnold Kramer of Texas A&M University titled Nazi Prisoners of War in America. The book was serious, academic, well documented. Gärtner called the author from a public telephone. He identified himself as Dennis Wiles and said he had enjoyed the book. The conversation dragged on. Eventually, Gärtner revealed who he really was. Kramer and Gärtner reached an agreement. They would write their story together, and Gärtner would turn himself in once the book was published. The book was called Hitler's Last Soldier in America. On September 11, 1985, 64-year-old Georg Gärtner appeared before immigration authorities in San Pedro, California, and turned himself in tears before television cameras. Authorities immediately released him, referring his case to the Denver office. Given his 21-year marriage to a U.S. citizen, his chances of staying in the United States were good. He died on January 30, 2013 in Longmont, Colorado. His story is the most accurate epilogue of the entire enterprise. A man who spent 40 years living the American life, invisible in it, raising a family, building a career, without having gone through any re-education program, without having heard any lectures on the principles of democracy, and that in the end he didn't want to leave. The honest answer is no one knows for sure, and the question is probably poorly phrased. Henry Ehrman himself, the historian who designed the SPD's German history courses and who was, of all the program's educators, the most thoughtful and least prone to self-deception, published an article in Social Research shortly after the program was disbanded. He admitted that prisoners during the courses showed a general inability to conduct an orderly debate, that most were incapable of listening to divergent opinions without becoming excessively agitated, and that the program's measurable effects on the mentality of the internees were, at best, ambiguous. The only systematic follow-up research that was done was that of Captain Moulton in 1947, who contacted some 500 graduates of elite projects in the American occupation zone. The result is already known: alienated men, ignored by the occupying government, with an acute feeling of having been trained for a role that no one had reserved for them. The comparison with the British program provides perspective. Britain had more than 400,000 German prisoners on its islands, the last of whom were not released until the spring of 1948. The British re-education program, the Foreign Office's prisoner of war division, was much more modest in its aims and much more sophisticated in its methods. The British did not try to manufacture convinced Democrats. They tried to induce behavioral changes within the camps themselves, betting that the profound changes would come on their own over time. His newspaper, Die Wochenpost, had the latest news on the front page and a whole section of advertisements from people searching for their lost families. Its graduates from the Wilton Park Centre were not repatriated. They returned to the fields to act as leaven from within. They managed, according to reports from the repatriation centres, to convince many soldiers of rank that their officers had had access to information about the true character of Nazism and had not acted on it. They eroded the building from below. Neither program changed Germany decisively. What changed Germany was what Georg Gärtner saw from the window of the ship that was taking him to the camp in 1943, and what Hans Schmid saw from the window of the train that was taking him home in 1946. The difference between a country that had not been bombed and a country that had been reduced to rubble. The destruction of the old order, the physical impossibility of rebuilding what had been, the hunger and cold that millions of Germans endured in the years immediately after the war. That was what discredited Nazism in a lasting way, far more than any class on democracy. Historian Ron Robin, whose study of the SPD's program is the most comprehensive available, put it this way: the magnitude of the defeat, the dismemberment of Prussia, the destruction of the Junker class, and the division of the country into two distinct ideological camps are some of the most convincing explanations for the rapid dissipation of National Socialism and the acceptance of Western values in significant parts of German society. The kind of democracy mattered, but the rubble mattered more. The network of German prison camps in the United States lasted in practice from 1942 to early 1946. During that period, the country's agricultural economy was largely sustained by this captive labor force. In 1944 alone, the company reported $22 million in revenue for the U.S. Treasury, plus an additional $80 million in savings from service on military installations. The longest-lasting effects were the least measurable. In dozens of rural communities in Michigan, Nebraska, Texas, Alabama, Florida, and Wisconsin, the presence of these men left sediments in the collective memory. Families who kept letters received between 1946 and 1950, farmers who sent food parcels to families in Germany who had nothing, grandchildren of those farmers who heard from their grandparents stories of prisoners singing in German from open trucks. At the Aliceville, Alabama camp, the largest in the country, prisoners built an elaborate wooden model of the Hamburg City Hall for Christmas 1944. It was 12 feet tall. It was a work of military craftsmanship that its authors knew would be left behind when they were deported. They did it anyway. In Frankenmuth, Michigan, a German man who returned home and named his newborn son after his American employer. In Oceana County, Michigan, an elderly woman who in 2018, 73 years later, was still looking for the words to explain that those men did not feel like the enemy, and that what I remembered most was the sound of their singing as they passed through the town street in open trucks in a language that no one understood to some fields that were not theirs. And in San Pedro, California, on September 11, 1985, A 64-year-old man with 40 years of American life on his back, turning himself into the authorities with tears on his face, closing the last page of a story that no one told for decades, and that speaks like few other things of what can come out when the most powerful and the most defeated find themselves in the same territory and have to, in some way, to understand each other.